Maintenant, je passe la main directement à Monsieur Bakhat Mohsin, confiné en Espagne et qui va animer la présentation de Monsieur Soufiane et Madame Yantan de Chine. Donc, Monsieur Mohsin, vous êtes là?
Oui, je suis là. Merci, c'est Mustafa.
À vous la main.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui, parfait.
Merci, Monsieur Mustafa, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Doyen.
Ah, d'accord.
Monsieur le Doyen, chers conférenciers, honorable assistance. Australia, Mr. Soufiane Erboub is an international advisor for the International Student Center at the University of Adelaide in Australia. Mr. Soufiane is a board member of the Council of Australian Arab Relations, what we call the CAAR. He's also a chairman and a board member, the Australian Arab Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the AACCI in South Australia. Mr. Soufiane will give us a response to the coronavirus pandemic. Mr. Soufiane, the floor is yours. À vous la parole.
Thank you very much. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Excellent. Look, first I would like to thank all the university on this initiative, and I have to admit I came in late into the party into this, so I do apologize in advance if you know the presentation that I'm given, it's not fully deep into the information, but what I'm going to attempt today is to give you an overview of the pandemic in coronavirus in Australia, how the Australian government responded to it, and also some information in relation to how we are moving forward into the future. My role in the university as an international advisor at the Office of the Vice President Academic, I was also on the task force of the COVID-19 in response to the university's pandemic and what steps we have taken. So I'm just gonna share short PowerPoint. If you can just let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can see it perfectly. It's clear.
So
go ahead.
Thank you. So the title is Australia's response to the coronavirus pandemic. And what I wanted to highlight here is how the country has responded to it in terms of the community side of things. So it's the country's collective good. As some of my presenters have mentioned earlier, as you can see, Australia is a big and vast country. So in itself, it's an island. And we have 6 different states. I reside in South Australia, in the south, in the city of Adelaide, and we have 2 territories as well. So the context that I would like to highlight before I just mention some of the information, which part of it is data, but also some of the response. I think it's important to give you a context in the last 5 months of 2020. Australia in itself has had what we call here a double whammy. If I can present to this timeline of 2020, back in December and also in January, you would have heard in the news that Australia had unprecedented bushfires, which has been burning for some times, and also have impacted on the country economically. That was around January. And then straight after that, obviously, as we moved into February, the initial travel ban, which was announced by the Prime Minister, that we will close our border to flights in terms of China and some countries as Iran and Italy. And obviously that has put in the pandemic and the people has gone into a sort of a drive in terms of buying panic, and that also brought in some restrictions of the essential sanitary product that was provided, such as sanitizers and masks and so on. And by the end of March, there was also early April, the Prime Minister announced a country lockdown. And everyone has moved to the online learning. So that is sort of just a brief to give you of where we are. Now, if I could talk about the response, I think in general, Australia's response to the coronavirus pandemic has done really relatively well. As of May 7th, the number of the country has only 6,896 confirmed cases of the coronavirus and recorded 97 deaths. One of the biggest strengths that we have as a country is that we have an incredible rate of testing relative to our population. So far, we've tested more than 700,000 tests, and that obviously has been conducted with only 1% of positive cases. Now, for a country of 25 million people with a globally connected economy and obviously predominantly urban population, a large tourist industry, this figure can be considered relatively positive in the larger scheme of the pandemic. So in a sense, Australia has been able to limit the virus impact. There is obviously one obvious feature that has enabled Australia, and this brings me to the community side of things, which restrict the spread of virus, but also in terms of geographical position of the country. It is, as I mentioned, is an island, so that played a very good advantage geographically. It allowed the country to be sealed off basically from the world and prevent any new sources of the virus entries, and that has made it very easy for Australia to quickly become less concerned with new sources of virus and focus its efforts on preventing community transmission related to the existing cases. Another factor might have been influential in Australia's response, that of the public trust, and this is very important to highlight, about trust in the competency of the Australian government and trust between individuals in Australian society. Australia has a remarkable stability within its civil society. This includes a significant amount of social cohesion among its highly diverse population, although we have had, unfortunately, and that's been some report of racist abuse against some of the Asian Australian, and that's usually it's due to apathy and due to ignorance from some of the public. So in general, I would say Australia has been cooperative public spirit, although in recent years the country has not been immune to some of the degradation of public trust that has befallen many Western countries. So the country's faith in the liberal democracy has been diminished by a culture usually of knee-jerk bipartisanship, the emergence of group of identity as a major driver of political discourse, social media siloing people's worldview, and conventional media shifting their business model away from the objective, normal reports of political advocacy. So I suppose the silver lining of this coronavirus is the way that the Australian people and the Australian public has pulled together towards an understanding of the country's collective good. It has given the public a greater sense of national purpose and also has provided them with the strength to contain the pandemic. I'm not going to talk so much about the economy and the impact of it, but I will mention some of the strategies that the Australian government has undertook in order to lessen the impact, and I'll go to that later on. But the virus has provided a good reason really for the community to put aside ideological consideration, and instead to focus and seek out quality information. And here the advice of people who have the relevant expertise, and that's usually the coming through the government, through the medical chief. One important thing, and as I mentioned, the 6 states, 2 territories, each state has as a premier, and territories have chief ministers. Along all that, we have the federal government that have obviously the prime minister and the cabinet. And the government has listened to the advice of medical experts and worked to create the necessary structure to limit the spread of the virus. And one initiative that has allowed the public to gauge the scope of this situation is the reposition of their usual approach to the country's politics. There's always the 2 parties country, and there's always that sort of pull and push from by both parties, the opposition and the governing party. But in this, we came together, and the approach of the country politics has been the formation of a national cabinet, a national cabinet specifically for the COVID-19. And this is a temporary body, include Prime Minister himself, Federal Prime Minister, and also the state premiers and chief territories, designed to allow the 2 levels of the government to pull their resources together and coordinate the responses within overlapping jurisdiction. That have provided a clear, consistent message to the public from the various leaders, and the national cabinet consists of an almost even numbers of leaders from both major political parties, which has given it more strength, so they have that bipartisan support. And that gives them also the ability and consideration to give the right response to the public. So despite the overall success of this coordinated approach of the pandemic, there has been some failures in the system, obviously, of governance. In mid-March, and not sure if you heard it in the news, 2,700 passengers from a cruise ship were allowed to freely disembark in Sydney, despite several passengers demonstrating symptoms of the coronavirus, and this failure to properly screen passengers has led to around 10% of Australia's total cases of the virus, causing close to 19 deaths. So that was in the state of New South Wales, and federal government have both sort of blame each other, pointing hand to each other. But that was probably the only exception out of all the initiative that they took. So like similar to Canada, Australians, we watch the news and we're aware that other countries are suffering far worse outbreaks of the pandemic, and that the overall response from the government have been competent given the circumstances. And after some initial problem, and the public's own personal respect for social distances, for example, measure has been excellent, and it's clearly working. So people have been listening to the message, they've been abiding to the message, and they've been doing what they've been asked to do. So stepping back for a wide angle view of the situation, I suppose Australia has had all the basic building blocks in place and had allowed to cope well with the unique pervasive problem like the coronavirus. So the country provides good education, health, and other public services to its citizens, and has an economic and civic structure that provide most people with access to opportunity and decent livelihood, with some serious exception like in the indigenous land. So Australia has I suppose, a professional political bureaucracy and trustworthy democratic institution. While the country often enthusiastic about the public representative, the politician, between brackets, it does have an instinctive trust of its public institutions, and also the advice of medical experts. So in terms of the economy, Australia with 16 years of economic, the last 16 years, Australia has an economic growth. So even we survived the GFC, had a AAA rating, and that allowed it to respond economically to this pandemic. In Australia, early in March, the Prime Minister announced a stimulus package worth $189 billion, providing basically cushioning for a number of SMEs and business being impacted by COVID-19. And I'm not going to go into the details, but basically looking at trying to put a slowdown of the impact that will come with this. And the reason for that is we don't know when this will finish. So I suppose they had to go hard and announce some measure, especially one that I will quote is the JobKeeper grants, which basically represent a strong response to the Australian economy going into hibernation to deal with the COVID-19. So the bold plan estimates 6.5 workers receive a minimum payment of $1,500 every 2 weeks to assist them in bridging the financial challenge caused by COVID-19. And the goal of that is that SMEs that they can basically keep their workers on the job. So that has proved arguably critical, not being able to create a condition to limit the spread of coronavirus in Australia and keep its casualty relatively low. So the economic package itself has actually worked because only 600,000, close to 650,000 that took the actual JobKeeper or applied for JobKeeper grants. So the budget was for 6.5 million. So there's room to move. There's still fund to actually provide and lessen the economic impact of the pandemic and ensure the jobless rate at a minimum. Only today, the National Cabinet met Friday the 8th, and he announced an announcement of gradual easing of restriction and of the lockdown into 3-step nationally, and that has been welcome, and that was based on a result of the health expert, but also on the positive data received nationally. And this is going to be in 3-step, gradually flow on from starting from Monday and also June, and then in July, should the number show a good and positive response of normal cases, or at least a very minimal cases, then we'll have a restriction lessened to confinement and people can go back out. In the state of South Australia, where I live, from Monday, we're able to go to coffee shops and go to restaurant. There is also back to the university in face-to-face mode, which is huge. All the university has been shut since March, so that's going to be good to be back at the university campuses. One of the initiatives that we should mention before I end my presentation is the government introduction of an application called COVID Safe. While controversial in terms of people claiming the privacy issues, basically the application being set up and designed by the government basically to for traceability in terms of COVID-19, and it's basically a secure record through your Bluetooth, determine when you are near another COVID safe user. Basically 2 people can put it in their phone. So if you are lining up in the supermarket and the other person have the same application through Bluetooth, the government can basically know where you're at and who you've been interacted with or closer to you within an environment, which give them obviously if one of those persons has been basically picked up for the virus or tested positive, the government can basically allow or advise that person who was close to them or who interacted with them that they should go and get tested. So far, it's been launched last week. 5 million people have downloaded the COVID Safe. This is part of going back to work and obviously to be able to trace and effectively limit the spread of the virus. That's the end of my presentation. Obviously, if there's any question later on, I'm happy to take that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Soufiane, for the nice presentation. It's very interesting and constructive, and it will shed light on all the main measures that have been done there in Australia regarding this pandemic crisis. Before passing to the next guest, I would like to give a summary in French for our guests and the present people here in this conference. So,
tu peux activer ta caméra, Mohsin?
Before we go to the next speaker, I would like to give a resume so the audience can get a clue about what has been said from our speaker, Mr. Soufiane. So I got some points here that I jot down. L'intervention de M. Soufiane s'articule sur la réponse économique du gouvernement australien au coronavirus. Dans sa réponse à la pandémie de coronavirus, l'Australie se porte relativement bien. Au 7 mai, le pays comptait en chiffre 6896 cas confirmés de coronavirus et enregistré plus ou moins 97 décès. Une des forces les plus grandes de l'Australie, c'est le taux incroyable de tests par rapport à la population. Jusqu'à présent, ils ont testé 722 540 tests qui ont été effectués avec seulement 1%. Pour un pays, Australie, c'est un pays assez grand, de 25 000, avec une économie mondiale connectée, d'une population majoritairement urbaine et une importante industrie touristique. Donc, il y a deux grands facteurs évidents qui ont permis à l'Australie de limiter la propagation du virus. Un, c'est la géographie. La géographie qui lui a permis de se fermer au monde et d'empêcher d'entrer de nouvelles sources du virus. Deux, c'est peut-être le plus influent, c'est la réaction de l'Australie, c'est-à-dire la confiance publique. À la fois la confiance dans la compétence des gouvernements australiens et la confiance entre les individus dans la société australienne. L'Australie jouit d'une stabilité remarquable au sein de sa société civile. Cela inclut une cohésion sociale importante au sein de sa population très diversifiée, bien qu'il y ait malheureusement asiatique. Monsieur Soufiane pense que le point positif de ce coronavirus est la manière dont il a ramené le public australien vers une compréhension du bien collectif des pays. Elle a donné au public un plus grand sens de l'objectif national. Le virus a fourni une raison de mettre de côté les considérations émotionnelles et idéologiques et de rechercher plutôt des informations de qualité et de tenir compte des conseils de personnes qui ont une expertise pertinente. Le gouvernement a écouté les conseils des experts médicaux et a travaillé à la création d'une structure nécessaire pour limiter la propagation du virus. Une des mesures ou des initiatives les plus intéressantes qui a été mise en place, c'est ce qu'on appelle la formation d'un cabinet national. Ce cabinet a été conçu pour permettre aux deux niveaux de gouvernement de mettre en commun leurs ressources, de coordonner leurs réponses et de fournir au public un message clair et cohérent de la part des différents dirigeants. Pour avoir une vue d'ensemble de la situation, l'Australie a mis en place tous les éléments de base qui lui ont permis de bien faire face à un problème unique et omniprésent comme ce problème de coronavirus. Le pays offre à ses citoyens une bonne éducation, des soins de santé, d'autres services publics dispose de structures économiques et civiques qui permettent à la plupart des gens d'avoir accès à des opportunités, à des moyens de subsistance décents. L'Australie aussi dispose également d'une bureaucratie professionnelle et apolitique et d'institutions démocratiques dignes de confiance. En ce qui concerne l'économie, après 16 ans de croissance économique, le plan de relance australien de quelques millions de dollars, lancé début mars, a permis d'amortir les effets du coronavirus sur un certain nombre de PME d'entreprises. Outre un certain nombre de mesures économiques, au centre se trouve ce qu'on appelle des subventions appelées en anglais Job Keeper, qui représente une réponse forte à la perspective de voir l'économie australienne entrer en récession et pour faire face à la crise sanitaire du Covid-19. Ce plan audacieux, qui devrait coûter 130 milliards de dollars sur une période de 6 mois jusqu'à septembre 2020, permettra à environ 6,5 millions de travailleurs de recevoir un paiement minimum de 1 500 dollars tous les 2 semaines pour les aider à surmonter le défi financier posé ou bien causé par ce Covid-19. Cette mesure s'est sans doute révélée essentielle pour créer les conditions permettant de limiter la propagation du coronavirus en Australie et de maintenir le nombre de victimes à un niveau relativement bas. Il s'agit également d'atténuer l'impact économique de la pandémie et d'assurer un taux de chômage minimum. L'annonce faite aujourd'hui par le Premier ministre d'un assouplissement progressif des restrictions en 3 étapes au niveau national a été bien accueillie grâce au Conseil des experts de la santé et aux données positives reçues au niveau national. Finalement, le gouvernement a mis en place une application mobile pour tracer les personnes qui sont affectées par le virus et limiter la propagation de cette pandémie. Et voilà. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Soufiane, pour cette présentation. Thank you very much for the presentation.